From the north to the south, real people.
So like I said to you, it's some serious elements of the outgoing membership of my party who's 10 year elapsed who are pleading with me to endorse an illegal extension and I refuse to be a part of any illegality.
Real stories every morning.
Most of the IDP, they stay in schools. And once they move in schools, when there is a disaster, the school in that area is automatically shut down.
This is Today in the News on Now Breakfast.
Today in the news on Now Breakfast, we begin with the National Bureau of Statistics, which has published the Nigeria Flood Impact Recovery and Mitigation Assessment Report for 2022 to 2023. The report reveals that 64% of those who were affected by the 2022 flooding in some way or the other were in the rural areas. Now, up to 49% of households had their main sources of food affected. The report goes on to measure the impact of the flood on health, mortality and morbidity, access to education and housing, as well as response and recovery. The 2022 floods killed over 600 persons, displaced 1.4 million persons, and injured 2,400 persons. Taiwo Ogunwunmi is a flood risk consultant, and he joins us this morning to discuss this. Taiwo, good morning, and I would like to ask, does it come as a surprise to you that the rural areas bore the greater brunt of the fallout of the floods?
No, it doesn't come as a surprise to me that the rural area are mostly affected by the flood, simply because the rural people they have a very, very low coping capacity when it comes to flood. And also, you also realize that it is in the rural area that necessary infrastructures are not in place, right? Like good drainage that can facilitate the flow of water. And then it's also very essential to remember that most of this rural area have low standard building, right? Of course, due to the fact that they are rural. And not that alone, it's also quite evident that rural areas are places where you have enormous expanse of lands. And that's where you have most of the agricultural activities going on. So in such kind of devastating flood as we have in 2022, they will most definitely be affected in one way or the other.
So, Mr. Ogunwunmi, this then begs the question of our response, right? This same report says just 1.5% of households that were affected received government assistance. And in the other percentage that received some form of assistance, they say that mostly came from friends and family. So, in your capacity as a flood risk assessment consultant, how exactly, what's the approach that we're supposed to take once we have actually gone through a flood disaster?
Yes, if we look at what is being done globally across several other advanced countries, whenever you have a flood disaster like such, the first thing is the emergency response. How do we respond to the people? How do we plan to evacuate them, to move them out of their disrupted houses onto a very good temporary shelter? At the same time, how do we provide kits to them, something that can sustain them, or food or clothing? We call it emergency kits, that can be used for a temporary period of time. But then I would also not be surprised that we have this very low percentage as stated by the people through the research that was conducted, because we are not really prepared as a country for such kind of emergency response for flood. And I think that's why you see that it's come as a shock that, we have this kind of enormous number of people being affected. So it's pretty much difficult for this kind of a provision to be made quickly. And I think it also boils down to lack of preparedness within the institutions, emergency institution, as well as the government, precisely. But then the people are much more right in an advanced country. You are responsible to the citizen to help them, to provide them with clothing and shelter. But this was not the case in the year 2022. You will see that many people were displaced. Even they are also more susceptible to, the women and children are even more susceptible to gender-based violence in this period because there's no place to stay. Most of them stay in temporary buildings, have no shelter, right? They could not eat food. There's no access to health facilities, at nearby neighborhood because some of these places have been destroyed by the flood. So it is quite it's quite a shortcoming for Nigeria this particular period of time. But what is done in advanced countries is that you have evacuation places, centers, right, already prepared. You provide them with temporary shelter and food and drinks and other things like that.
Right. Mr. Ogunwunmi, you're right when you talk about responsibility and what is done elsewhere. Now, this report we're looking at is suggesting the development of a flood management scheme. At this time, we don't know if the government is developing one, but what do you think a flood management scheme would entail?
Yeah, a flood management scheme will attain all the components of disaster management itself. So, how do we mitigate flood? That's one. Two is how do we prepare for flood across all the ministry, across all communities, across all the states. So preparedness is key, mitigation is key, response is key, and then recovery. So preparedness, prevention / mitigation, response and recovery. So if you want to develop a scheme, we must ensure that one, how are the people prepared for flood, for future flood, for example? Is the ministry prepares, the department in charge, are they well equipped enough? Do they have the capacity? Are they trained? Do we have an evacuation center, right? Do we have emergency kits for such kind of flood if it occurs? So that should be covered. Mitigation or prevention. How do we reduce flood? Okay, this particular research that you mentioned just now, I'd be able to examine the root causes of the flood at the first place. What causes the flood, right? What can we do? What engineering solution can we put in place, right? So this particular scheme must include that. Then how do we respond? So it's very important that this report has showcased our gap, right, in the previous years, and then they stand as a bedrock for us to now step forward and say, well, we didn't respond so well. How do we respond in the coming time, right? And then how do we build the capacity of the people? How do we ensure that the farmers are equipped enough to have, activities that are more flood resilient, right? And then the second part is the recovery, right? The recovery. So when people experience this kind of flood, yes, what kind of program, do we have in place to strengthen them to build back better, like the UNDRI would say. So to build it back. So every scheme, if we were to say, well, we have any of the scheme that we're planning to do, it must consist of these 4 components. And it must not just be done by the government alone. It must include the stakeholders. It must include experts in the country. It must also include every ministry, department, and agency of the government. So, and as well as community leaders, basically.
Mr. Ogunwunmi, I mean, if we go further into some of the suggestions that were made, they also speak about infrastructure resilience. The report said about 22.9% of health facilities were totally damaged in last year's flooding, right? And this begs the question around our approach towards infrastructure that actually resists the impact of such disasters. It goes further. I want to link it to a different part that speaks about, and you mentioned it, the post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. It seems this is the right time to sort of take advantage of this particular suggestion around resilient infrastructure. How would we go about, what are the necessary agencies we would need to pull together to discuss what it would look like?
Yes, when you look at this, you remember that in Nigeria, we have the Ministry of Land Use Planning, we have the Ministry for Works, we have as well, as you mentioned, the health facilities. Now we have the Ministry of Health. And as well, when it comes to this, we have so many engineering solutions that can make a particular country, state, or a community be resilient to the impact of flood. And that's why you mentioned infrastructure. For example, now we have low standard building, right? That may not be able to withstand the impact of flood. And I think this comes to the fact that some buildings are not standard enough and they are approved by the ministry in charge. At the same time, there are a couple of drainage, projects that have been approved for some times that have not been implemented, right? Probably due to poor fund management and a couple of things like that. And if I thought that we really want to be resilient in the next years to come, which is the fact that when flood happens, the system will be able to absorb, right, the effect of flood, and it will be able to bounce forward quickly. And that's that's the true definition of resilience. So perhaps if we want to do that, it has to be to the fact that we must, of course, put more focus on our engineering response, right? Our drainage, our constructions. Also ensure that every building, every houses are well standard enough, built at the particular standard that are being set. And as well, health facilities have to be strengthened. We have so many small primary health cares that are also low standard build, and that's why you realize that when you have flood, even the hospitals also are affected. So where do you take the people to in the event of flood? And not that alone, also how many hospitals do we even have around? So in this case, you are talking about, okay, we might probably tell you that, one health facility is affected, whereas normally there should be a great number of health facilities across, even in several other neighborhoods, that people can be able to access in this kind of emergency period. So facilities should be very good standard enough at some point. And then these are predictions, right, that we probably know already that, flood can occur in this kind of places. So it's also very important that where we situate some of these facilities, that is where they are being located, it's very important that we first of all understand, well, are they at the flood susceptibility zones or locations? So this will equally help us in the future.
Well, Mr. Ogunwunmi, the flood continues to affect people, and the numbers are a little scary. And I'm asking this because if we're looking at increased numbers of people who are failing to eat properly or eat healthy meals, it means that our numbers for kwashiorkor and other food and nutrition-based diseases will continue to rise. Is it possible for you to rate what has been done so far to help out the people who are directly affected? We know what the numbers say, but has there been an attempt to improve our responses to those affected by floods?
I won't know precisely. I think because, we can only be able to understand that if we have let me say, for example, if we have a report that truly assess that, you can read in newspaper or somewhere, somebody can say that, well, we created a relief programs for those that were affected, right? Somebody can tell you that, well, the agency distributed foods and other items to people that was affected by the flood. But then, to what extent does this reach the people that are indeed affected by the flood? So I will not necessarily know this, because they are very, very sensitive information that we must be sure about. But I believe that is definitely what we're supposed to do, right? Particularly this particular research that we are talking about right now, released by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. Is for implementation, right? It's for action to be taken. It's for to find out, these people, right? Who are the people being affected, by flood, by low access to food and availability, or who are the market women that have been affected? How do we reach them? How do we give them some capital, right, so that they can recover as soon as possible? But I'm not aware of any activities or probably any program that was in place to really strengthen these people or bring them back to normal.
All right, Mr. Ogunwunmi, thank you very much for speaking with us on this conversation this morning. Our guest is Mr. Taiwo Ogunwunmi, a flood risk consultant, and he joined us this morning to speak on the National Bureau of Statistics report that focused on the impact, the recovery, and the mitigation of flooding that happened between the years 2022 and 2023. It's still Now Breakfast, and the